As I write this, I'm acutely aware that despite all the time I've spent playing and thinking about Deadly Premonition, there remain many parts of the game I'm still uncertain about, far more than I would like. I'm not sure I should have spent my time playing it. I'm not sure whether I should have continued playing it once I realised what the game was like, and I'm not even sure whether I should ever recommend anyone that watches this review should play it. That said, there are definitely things about Deadly Premonition of which I am certain, and I think the best thing is to begin with those. First impressions are important, and recognising this, Deadly Premonition starts by giving players a taste of its unpalatable and off-putting mix of sex, innocence and gore. These themes, their unsettling combination and their effective use dramatically shape the player's entire experience with Deadly Premonition. But before one can stop to take stock, an even more unsightly side of the game has already shown its face. On this point, I need to be direct. By far the most noticeable and invasive flaws of Deadly Premonition all relate to the technical implementation of the game's admittedly commendable creative ideas. Nevertheless, I must stress that no matter what virtues I might henceforth extol, these shortcomings are so pervasive that there is a significant danger that for many players, these issues will mar any sense of enjoyment the game can provide. This is a polite way of saying that, in brief, Deadly Premonition runs poorly and looks awful in almost every conceivable way, and its performance issues are by no means limited to any one aspect of the game. These blemishes include the detail of its characters, their animations, the visual appeal of its setting and world, the game's performance at all times, and much, much more. In terms of the game's gameplay systems, and it's often a stretch to even use the word gameplay, Deadly Premonition lacks proficiency to such an extent that the horror gameplay levels the game offers function only as to remind the player that Deadly Premonition is in fact a horror game rather than a comedy. They offer no challenge, and they do little to add any sense of tension that more proficient survival horror games go to great lengths to achieve. Gameplay is not the only facet of the game that feels underdeveloped, to put it nicely. Deadly Premonition is also an open world game, or rather has open world elements. By both modern standards and the standards of its contemporaries, this open world is, to put it bluntly, barren, uninteresting and cumbersome to navigate. Although at this point I feel strongly inclined to dig deeper and detail these many shortcomings at greater length, and they are many, let it be known, I feel that not only have I made it clear the game's flaws are numerous, considerable and far-reaching, but I also feel that doing so may mask the most important point I have to make about Deadly Premonition. I like it, and ultimately enjoyed my time with it, and I think I'd much rather spend the rest of this video discussing and to an extent figuring out why. The first reason I believe is already clear. Deadly Premonition is ambitious both technically and narratively. Although, as I mentioned, the open world itself is off-putting, the use of characters therein is worth particular commendation. The story of Deadly Premonition is centered on the concept of criminal profiling, so character is very important narratively. This emphasis is mirrored in the implementation of characters within the game world, who are actors with routines, patterns of behavior, and some relatively organic, adaptive conversations. These characters go about their business and can be questioned to reveal information as the core of the story progresses. This attempt to create more realistic actors within the world allows players to begin to conceptually handle these characters organically. Players can thus use skills they may already have or can imagine might work in order to profile the town's finite population, a very rewarding process. Greenvale itself, the sleepy coniferous setting, also becomes a character to an extent too, when the tedious but realistic navigation between locations is occasionally extremely effective in giving players either a moment to catch their breath after a large revelation and time to ponder what they've learned, or to really reinforce a sense of panic when rushing desperately to the scene of an emergency from the far side of town. Although this can be stifled to a great extent by how willing the player is to tolerate the burdensome and laborious navigation that includes glacially slow loading screens and long animations to enter and exit the car, very occasionally it becomes clear exactly how Deadly Premonition wishes its open world can add to the player experience, and the idea shines through to great effect. Another reason I've chosen to lay out my critique of the game in this order is that when you're aware of these flaws and have some witness to the ambition of the game, it becomes clear how the game has managed to generate its cult status by planting speculative seeds inside observant players that bloom into an enjoyable uncertainty about the obscure but potentially cerebral side of the game. Let me explain. First, Deadly Premonition's extremely limited sets of animated gestures and gesticulations, its blank lifeless faces, and poor dialogue writing all seem to fly so openly in the face of what I've noted seems to be the game's foremost goal of creating genuine characters through its systematic emphasis on realistic actors. This is reinforced by extremely inelegant and wholly awkward interactions.
So Becky did entrust the locket to them, and now Carol has it.
In the starkest of contrasts, however, one of the game's strongest aspects is the vocal performances, which convey quite a lot of personality and regularly capture an appropriate tone and gravity, despite dealing with inelegant dialogue.
Don't know how to say that. We really don't need your help. Unlike some of your corrupt city police officers, I play it by the book. I hope you'll come to appreciate that, Agent Morgan.
In the end, these oddly conflicting factors coalesce to create some of the most personable robots you've ever had the privilege to meet. The influence of this dynamic is so great as to appear that the game is actually testing the limits of just how unhuman a character can be before it becomes impossible to empathize or relate to them at all anymore. It's utterly and thoroughly bizarre.
Did you see that, Zach? Clear as a crisp spring morning. F.K. in the coffee. I knew I could count on it. Never fails.
Now then, let's get going.
A somewhat related point is just how the game's drab visual and graphical depiction of Greenvale and its dense coniferous landscapes actually manages to accidentally but effectively capture the sparseness and bleakness of the real-life setting, and thus reinforce the blandness of the location, of which York, our main character accustomed to city life, constantly reminds us. The second factor that played a large role in my experience with Deadly Premonition, and contributes strongly to the game's strange cerebral side, is mystery. This applies in many ways, some of which are quite interesting. The most obvious are the narrative elements at the heart of the game, the murders and the search for the rogue raincoat killer, the surrounding mysteries related to York and Zack, as well as the character systems that impart a framework that allows players to handle the mystery quite fully. Apart from this, however, there are other more mysterious elements that seeped into my experience with Deadly Premonition, not necessarily related to the game at all, but nonetheless contributed. The first was my desire to engage in a comparative analysis between the version I was playing and the original release of the game. Knowing I was playing a director's cut, I found myself questioning whether this game was simply a bad port of the original version, which surely must have run better. I wondered whether the difficulty had been decreased from the original release, and if the gameplay had been made worse, because the game was tailored for PlayStation Move features, which I wasn't using, and whether the awful lock-on system had been added then. At one point, the hilarious thought even slipped into my mind that this might even be considered a superior, better port of the original release, which would have been truly jaw-dropping if true. Another element of this is the other ancillary systems of the game, which, having completed it, I still have absolutely no idea about, even though I spent about 20 hours playing Deadly Premonition. This includes the sleep and hunger systems, the enemies that appear at certain times outside of dungeons, and the economy system that I didn't notice have any effect on my time with the game at all. Yet another element of this is the contribution of the game's many technical blotches to a sense that the game could at any time unravel in your hands, and you're simply there holding it together. This greatly amplifies the sense of mystery in a way that is distinct to any new twists or turns in the tale. You simply have no idea what will happen next because you cannot be entirely sure the game will not crash at any moment. This generates a hilariously genuine fear and uncertainty about what is ahead of you. This thematic sense of holding it all together until you reach the finish line ties unintentionally yet unbelievably and somehow poetically into the final narrative revelations at the end of the game. At this point, I have to interject and emphasize that I'm not suggesting that the game is necessarily attempting to achieve any of this. I simply want to note how the game manages to generate these questions, and that wrestling with these ideas as you play becomes a major part of the experience with Deadly Premonition and somehow makes it more enjoyable. Another critical element of Deadly Premonition is humour. Not only does the game emphasize humour throughout the story, but there's also a layer of humour that is strong that can also be closely aligned with Deadly Premonition's cult reputation. The best way to explain what I mean is simply to show you. I call this the why section. Why is fast travel hidden? Why do we have an odd breakfast scene with a bad audio mix where you can't hear anything? Why does York use the same sets of gesticulations constantly? Why not just have him not gesticulate? Why do we jump from serious to deeply comedic in seconds?
The perpetrator cut out Hannah's tongue. Directed by John Landis, 1981.
Why do interactions such as the following even exist?
Isaac and Isaiah said that Anna was a fairy of the forest, a goddess.
Okay, so far we know Deadly Premonition is a deeply technically flawed game that has some genuinely great ideas that shine through from time to time, and whose flaws unintentionally add many extra dimensions to the game, many of them humorous. Now, this might explain why the game is memorable, but doesn't fully explain why I liked it. The two final things I want to mention about Deadly Premonition are, unsurprisingly, tied together. Those are its strong emphasis on the protagonist and its thematic richness. These two elements work in tandem to produce quite a meaningful tale. I'll begin with the latter. Deadly Premonition wields theme and imagery with a surprising proficiency. First, Deadly Premonition is coated in a strong layer of religious symbolism. Characters are often depicted in religious poses, musical revelation carries an angelic, otherworldly tone, and purity and innocence, often the subject of religious thought, are regularly placed as central elements of various characters. Twins, duplicity, and duality are then often used to reinforce the opposing religious notions of good and evil, heaven and hell. The second of Deadly Premonition's strongest motifs is nature and growth, represented throughout the game by the seed, the tree, and the forest. These two separate thematic branches are brought together at the end of the game and transform Deadly Premonition into a meditation on the nature of trauma, recovery, and mental illness. The Raincoat Killer, who kills only when it rains, represents that part of a person that only comes out at the worst of times. Rain, of course, necessary for growth, allows the malevolent seeds planted inside characters to burst forth, eventually forcing York to accept that, no matter how painful, there are indeed things that must be purged from this world. The presence of the evil outside force, a preposterous character orchestrating these tragedies on the community of Greenvale for their own entertainment, lends an almost cruelly comedic tone to the trials of characters trying to deal with their response to past trauma, and even more broadly, to the nature of life and all human struggle. Gaming has the ability to frame stories both as things that belong to the player or things that belong to the character being played, or, most interestingly of all, as somewhere in between the two. Deadly Premonition seizes on this advantage by using York's many soliloquies and eccentricities to make the player experience deeply entwined with York and his journey, while the game's modest scope and character systems also ensure that Deadly Premonition is also a game about people and community. For this reason, Deadly Premonition comes across as a deeply personal game with great heart, that despite its many technical drawbacks, still gives the impression that its vision, especially relating to its protagonist, hasn't been compromised. So, after all this, I'm still here, struggling to write a conclusion for this review, and still not entirely sure why I like Deadly Premonition. I can tell you for sure why I shouldn't like it. Those reasons are many, and I don't even feel like I've done justice to explaining and detailing the many issues and problems the game has. I know for sure why you shouldn't play Deadly Premonition 2. It's slow, tedious, bizarre, and unfocused. However, the last thing I definitely do know is that a beaming smile came across my face as Deadly Premonition came to an end. The game's ending unfolded, and the mysteries about York, Zack, and the Raincoat Killer were finally explained. And as I sit here and really think about how the game managed to do any of this, I think the fact that I still can't quite put my finger on it is what makes it so special.
Sure, that's one way of looking at it, but it's totally wrong. Listen, they both need each other. It's called interdependency, and they both know it. Yeah, I know. He does terrible things to Tom. Nasty, even sadistic things. But that's fine, as long as that's what Tom wants. Think of it. His actions. He's always asking for it. It's his partner's job to fulfill that need, and Jerry knows that.